Welcome to Cybersecurity Risk Assessment for Safety Critical Systems, here in South Pacific with your speaker, Dr. Live Vessels. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2 during the day, and for the welcome reception starting just after this talk at 5:30 p.m. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2, and please join us for the Pony Awards starting at 6:30 p.m. in Lagoon JKL. Please put your phone on vibrate, which makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore it ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick it up. And now, Dr. Vessels.
Thank you, Brandon. Welcome to the last talk of the day. I hope you guys have been having a great time so far and learning a lot. Before I get started, it's Lee, actually, not Lai. So a little bit about who I am and who we are, and then the content of the presentations. So, like I said, I'm Lee Vessels. I'm one of the cybersecurity architects at Honeywell. I have been doing software system and security for over 30 years. I acquired those experiences through a small number of companies, such as Microsoft, IBM, Sandia National Labs, General Dynamics, and now with Honeywell. Probably the most noticeable thing about me and my work over the last 30 years has been the work that I've done with the blue screen of death. Yeah, I'm one of the original authors of the blue screen of death. Most recently, the things I'm passionate about is the SAE G32 standards for cyber-physical system security. I'm the co-chair of the Software Assurance Committee there. If you guys are interested in that, come and see me afterward. My co-authors, who cannot be here, are Dr. Daniel Johnson and Dr. Kenneth Heffner. They have been doing cyber-physical security for over 30 years with Honeywell. Dr. Daniel Johnson co-chaired the airworthiness security process, which is currently being used now for certification of avionics systems and airplanes. We at Honeywell work on development of advanced breakthrough technologies. We worked on securing cyber-physical systems such as space system, and we also do compliances for Honeywell and for our customers. The rest of the talk will go something like this. I will give you guys a very high-level overview of the cybersecurity attacks for space system, very high level. And then I'll talk about the motivation behind our work. Then I'll focus most of the presentation on our work. Then I'll wrap up with what we're doing next. And then I'll give you guys a takeaway to take with you. Does that sound good? Okay. So, the major attack on space system. To start out with, I want everybody to know that the information I'm presented here are all available in the public. They're not sensitive to Honeywell or to our customers. Let's start in the year 2014 when Computer World reported that satellite communication system is full of security flaws. They reported research done on 10 different systems, common system, and they found security flaws such as multiple backdoors, hard-code credentials, really weak protocol, or mostly undocumented protocol. They have also found weak encryption algorithm or no encryption algorithm whatsoever. One of the things you can do with these flaws is to remotely dial into the satellite communication system without any authentication whatsoever. Let's fast forward a little bit to the year 2018, which is last year. Future Society actually reported the impacts of these security flaws to include such things as pinpointing military units' locations, being able to disrupt onboard satellite communication system, being able to remotely disrupt in-flight Wi-Fi system, as well as being able to provoke malfunction critical navigational system, and to some extent affect human health. Then just recently, Cybersecurity Insider actually urge companies that supply satellite services and equipment to be on high alert for potential cyber attack. In fact, in June of this year, there has been an attack on JBL system. What's interesting about that attack actually is the fact that they're able to move into the deep space network. So as you can see, this is a real problem for us. We're not talking about enterprise where you could just reboot. This is a problem where lives are at stake, infrastructure that are critical to us are at stake. So how do we address this pandemic problem? How do we begin to look at that? To quote our keynote speaker this morning, he said, we should always start with a yes, right? So we can fix this problem. So what do? He said that we should start with understanding the job at hand. But how do we begin to understand the job at hand, the such massive job at hand? So let's look at what Irwin Land, the father of satellite reconnaissance, had to say about this. Now, he said, we can't fix all problems. What we can do is identify them and focus our resources appropriately. So one way at Honeywell that we can identify the problem is to look at assessing the cybersecurity risks of the systems. So we began at the time by looking at what can be used to assess cybersecurity risks for space systems, for critical systems. What we found is that there's a strong focus on threat modeling, mostly for the enterprise level. We found that of these modeling tools, techniques, tips, and solutions, they require deep knowledge of security, mathematics, and the targeted system. Now, this may sound easy, but in reality, it's really hard to get all that skill set in an organization or in one person that's modeling. Moreover, these techniques are very manually intense, require a lot of time spent. 2,000 hours is not unheard of for a typical system, which is a man-year. Now, if it takes you a man-year to assess the cybersecurity risk of a system, that's not scalable, right? Additionally, they introduce a lot of air into the system, so it's hard to make strategic decisions when a system that you're trying to model and the report that you're trying to report has built-in errors in it. So at the time, we couldn't find any framework or solutions that actually help us assess the risks of cyber-physical systems, such as space systems, that is easy to use and repeatable and have a method that you can go back to do a what-if study. So under the guidance of Dr. Daniel Johnson, our co-author, we started a framework at Honeywell. This framework was actually the basis for the two standards I mentioned that is currently being used for certification by FAA. This standard has, this framework has 5 steps to it. And it is not a waterfall process, it's actually an iterative process that you can go back and do analysis and do what-if studies and actually move forward and backward. The rest of my presentation will cover these 5 steps. So the first step is to create your security architecture. That should be simple, right? In fact, this is the hardest step, and it'll probably take the most time, and if you do this right, the rest of the step comes easier. So how do you create a security architecture? Is there a formula to doing that? Here are some basic tips. First, you define your security perimeters. A perimeter is a notional boundary that's actually separate your security context. It actually encompasses your security-related assets, the assets you wanted to protect. So you've probably been thinking, why can't I just draw a box around my system? Well, a lot of time your system doesn't contain all security relevant information or your asset, right? What you want to do is focus on the security critical assets and actually draw a perimeter around that. The second thing you need to do is identify those assets that you're trying to protect or the assets that are related to the assets that you're trying to protect. The third step is to actually identify the external system or user to your targeted system, and then identify all the connections that exist. Now, it's very important that you identify the connections. If the connection does not exist, it's very important not to connect them, okay? So these are the basic steps to creating the security architecture. Now, getting the security architecture right is critical to all the other 4 steps to come. Now, you probably think, boy, this is going to take a lot of time. It does, but the framework encourages to move forward, get some basic information in place, and come back when you have more data. And the whole framework will preserve the data that you work on so that you can go back and forth. So here's an example of a security architecture. This is a space constellation. It's fictitious. Nothing here is real. I just want everybody to know that. The relationship is not real. Anything that resembles reality is not intentional. For the sake of this presentation, I will just focus on gray sand and model the security architecture for gray sand. And just so that we do not expose any sensitive data, I will pretend that gray sand has a network, 3 mission assets to protect, 2 protection solution in place, that is the network's security and the spectrum security solution, and a couple of attackers. So once you finish your architecture, the second step in the framework is to create what we call scoring of those attributes. The way to do that is you identify your attackers. And we call them attackers, but they could be a bad guy or they could be a good guy. Okay, so we just call them attackers. So once we identify them, they are usually the systems and user outside of your security perimeter. In this case, we got 2 in this example, the spectrum spoof and the general attackers. So we label them in our framework. We label all attacker with an A dot and whatever names you want to give it. And then we assign it an occurrence value of 1 to 9. Okay, 1 being the most trusted, 9 being the least trusted. An example of a trusted attacker would be somebody like a pilot, okay, who has access to the system, but he's trusted. We can count on him. An example of an untrusted attacker would be an internet, or if you have your avionics system attached to the internet. The second thing you do is you define your vulnerabilities of your system. The easiest way to define your vulnerability is to identify your protections you have in place. The protection has some level of vulnerability built in. So in our case, we got 2, so we named them. In our framework, it starts with F, and whatever names you wanted, and we assign it some values between 1 and 9. 1 being the most robust, 9 being the least robust. Now, you probably asked the question of where these numbers come from. How do I know what numbers to assign? At this point in our framework, that is up to the architect that is modeling the system. We are working with the SAE G32 to come up with standards. So each one of these numbers stand for something that's meaningful. The next thing in our process is to find that protection in place. And we talked about those being, there are 2 of them. And our framework actually require you to name them that start with an O. And then we have to associate it with the failure that we just identified or the vulnerability that we identified earlier. The next thing is to identify your attack vectors, which is access into your vulnerabilities or access into their conditions. In this situation, we have 2, the path that gets into the gray sand network. So we name those 2 paths with an AV dot something, and we associate that with the protection that's in the system. The next thing to do is to actually define your threat conditions. The threat conditions is a condition that will cause a failure of your assets. And in this situation, we have 2 threat conditions coming from that 2 vectors. So our threat conditions are named with T dot something, and we associate that with the access vector that it comes from. The last thing that we needed to associate and score is the identity of the assets. So we named the assets in place. All this information along with the security architecture, are used as inputs into the next step, which is the modeling itself. So in step 3, we take the security architecture, your scores that you come up with, and the relationship. We feed that into our modeling engines, and we generate what we call cut sets. The modeling engines consist of 2 different models, and those information are available for you to do what-if studies. The first model is the security ontology model that shows relationship between all your security elements, like what vectors is accessed by which threat conditions. And then the second one are threat modeling that show you the probability of an attack for a particular cut set. So cut sets is a collection of your vulnerabilities and your attackers that would cause the threat condition to occur. So you can think of cut set as all the possible paths into your targeted system. We take those cut sets, we feed it into our calculation engine, and we create what we call threat scenario. Threat scenarios is a situation that will cause your assets to fail. The calculation engine will create various numbers that is critical to the security risk assessments. So these numbers are used in the final step, which we looked up in the acceptable matrix to determine whether those risk level, probabilities, and severity are acceptable or not. So if your number comes out as a negative number, then that's a low risk to your system, and that's acceptable. If your number is 0, then it's a medium risk. Small changes need to be made, but not huge changes. If the number is positive, that means it's a high-risk situation and you need to do some fixing. The other thing that it does give you an idea and an indicator is that if it's a positive number, let's say 2, then you can look at the criticality of your assets and say, is my asset critical that if it does get attacked, am I in a situation that I'm causing damages to human health? So if your asset is a maintenance system, for example, and it never touched the avionics system, the fly, the flap, the brakes, then you may make the decision that that's a lower priority for me to fix. If your assets turn out to be a critical asset in your space system, then that will give you some alarm that needs to be higher priority. On the other extreme, if your risk level is really low, let's say minus 100, then you can ask the question, do I have too much protection in place? In theory, there's no such thing as too much protection, but keep in mind that every time you add security solution into a system, it affects the system attributes like performance, right? It also affects the bottom dollars, as well as maintenance of that system. So is it worthwhile to remove some of those security protection so that you will have more of an agile system in place? So all that information can be used, and as Jeff said this morning in the keynote speaker, to communicate to leadership to put the right priority in the right place to get the right problem fixed. So that's it, that's my 5 steps. What are we working on next? We're trying to finish the automation so that you have an end-to-end automations of our framework so that you can start with the architecture model and end with your risk level, and then you can go back and forth and the data stay persistent. The other things we're doing, and I'm very passionate about, is to actually work with the standard committees to define standards for how to assess vulnerabilities for cyber-physical system, not enterprise system, but cyber-physical system, as well as assessing attackers in the system. So once we finish the automation, we will have a tool set that security professional can use to assess risk and produce a rapidly result that is repeatable. In summary, cyber attack is real. It's here. It's attacking, as you can see with the JPL problem, space system. One way to begin to remediate some of these issues we have is to know what we're facing and to have priorities on what we need to fix. Honeywell has produced a repeatable framework that is standardized, and it's based on a standard process for assessing risk. We also have a paper at the end of this presentation. Feel free to read it and give me your thoughts. Here are my information. I look forward to hearing from you and getting your feedback and collaborating with you on all the works that we have done so far. I will take some questions. If you have some questions, there's mics up there, but I will also be in the wrap room for some of the more critical questions. Okay. That's it. Okay.
Okay.
Can you? I can't hear you. Can you use the mic?
Okay. Okay. Since I beat him to the mic, let me ask the question. Okay.
Go ahead.
I have actually two questions. The way you're describing the system, to me, it looks like a regular cyber system rather than a cyber physical system, because normally cyber physical system, they control some physical part of the world. So I'm not quite sure where is the physical control comes from. Okay, then my second question is, how are you different from NIST risk methodology? Because risk methodology also starts with the assets and what vulnerability you have and what are the controls you already have, and then you explore what is the probability some threat actor may exploit the vulnerability and so on and so forth. So anyway, I'm just trying to get a better feel for how your methodology is different from the NIST methodology. And the second thing is, what is so cyber physical about your system? It seems to me it's very cyber. Anyway, if you can comment on both, that'll be good.
Okay. So I want to make sure the difference that our framework has from NIST is that we actually assess risk based on a cyber-physical system, which is a system that is a combination of physical, network, cybers, and analogs. Right? We are focusing more on scoring that risk closer to real-time system than it is for NIST, where it's scored medium, high, or low. You know, we don't have that larger granularity. We need to score a smaller granularity between the probabilities. NIST doesn't do that. So this gives you the ability to model closer to real time.
Thank you.
Ma'am, my question is similar. When would you recommend the framework you've proposed now as opposed to like the NIST framework or other methodologies?
I would use NIST for more of an enterprise type systems. I would use this for more of a safety type system. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
NIST also has an example where they apply it to infusion pump, which is a real cyber physical system.
You're saying that NIST has an example? So I'm not familiar with that. I can take a look at that and get back to you on that. I haven't seen it.
My question is a little bit similar. It's all based off NIST. I currently do risk assessment for the Department of Defense, and we have a number of overlays that are involved with the NIST 853. And as this develops, because this is the next big thing, do you foresee another overlay being applied into this risk assessment? And would this be able to be utilized in some sort of enterprise solution such as EMAS or Exacta?
So you're saying that you work on Oracle, is that what you said?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Did you say you work on Oracle as you were assessing risk on Oracle? Is that what you said?
No.
Okay. Say that again. I didn't hear you.
The NIST frameworks, the 853, the overlays. Do you foresee this being a new overlay for space systems?
I don't, and the reason being is this is more of a tools that you can use for safety critical system, not so much as an overlay for the RMF. Does that make sense? You can use this throughout your life cycle as you assess your assurance level in your development of your system, where RMS is tailored toward more for certification of your system. RMS is a broader standard, where this is more of a feed into that. I don't see this as an overlay.
That makes sense, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.